Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I ordered Uber from the dark web. An empty taxi parked in front of my door. So, I've been a bit of a thrill seeker my whole life. I guess you could say I get bored easily, and I've always needed something more extreme to get my adrenaline going. Normal stuff, like skydiving or bungee jumping, just doesn't do it for me anymore. So, when I heard about the dark web from a friend, I was intrigued. The stories about illegal marketplaces, hitmen for hire, and other crazy stuff made my heart race. One night, after a few too many drinks, I decided to dive in. I spent hours clicking through sketchy links and reading forums that made my skin crawl. Then I stumbled upon a service I'd never heard of, Dark Uber. It promised an experience unlike any other, tailored to your deepest fears. The tagline read, "Ready for the ride of your life?" It was perfect. I was drunk and looking for a thrill, so I filled out the form, paid in Bitcoin, and waited. Nothing happened for a couple of days. I figured it was a scam and forgot about it. But then, last Friday, around midnight, I got a notification. A car was on its way. The app had a timer, counting down the minutes. I felt a jolt of excitement and a twinge of fear. I sat on my porch, watching the seconds tick away. Then right on time, an old beat-up taxi pulled up in front of my house. There was no driver. I approached the car cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside, but the door on the passenger side swung open on its own. I hesitated. This was exactly the kind of thrill I had been looking for, but something felt off. Still, my curiosity got the better of me, and I climbed in. The interior was old and smelled like mildew and something metallic, like blood. The door shut behind me with a thud, and I noticed there was no way to open it from the inside. Panic started to set in, but before I could react, the car started moving. I fumbled for my phone to call for help, but it had no signal. The app, however, was still working. A message popped up. Relax and enjoy the ride. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just an elaborate prank or some kind of immersive experience. But then the first stop came. We pulled up to an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a town. The door swung open again, and I was almost too scared to step out. But the screen on my phone flashed with another message. Enter the warehouse. I took a deep breath and got out of the car, the door slamming shut behind me. The warehouse was pitch black, but my phone's flashlight provided a small beam of light. I could hear faint noises, scuttling, maybe rats or something worse. The air was thick with dust and the stench of rot. As I walked deeper into the building, the noises grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like whispers, but not in any language I could understand. Suddenly, my phone's light flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I stood there, frozen, listening to the whispers growing closer. I fumbled to turn my phone back on, and when I did, I saw them, faces pale and ghostly, staring at me from the shadows. They had no eyes, just dark, empty sockets, and their mouths hung open in silent screams. I bolted back towards the entrance, but it was gone. The space seemed to have shifted, the walls closing in around me. I was trapped. My phone buzzed with another message. Find the key. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I turned back towards the faces, and they started moving, slowly at first, then faster, their limbs jerking unnaturally. I ran deeper into the warehouse, the faces pursuing me. I stumbled over debris, cutting my hands and knees, but I couldn't stop. I had to find the key. I came to a door marked with a crudely painted symbol, a circle with an X through it. I pushed it open and found myself in a small room, lit by a single flickering bulb. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was an old rusty key. I grabbed it, and the moment I did, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. I turned to leave, and the faces were gone. I made my way back through the now eerily silent warehouse, my heart still racing. When I stepped outside, the taxi was waiting. The door opened for me again, and I climbed in, clutching the key. The car started moving, and I felt a small sense of relief. But then, my phone buzzed with another message. Next stop, home. I should have been relieved, but I wasn't. I felt a sense of dread creeping in. As the car drove through the dark, deserted streets, I noticed something was off. The houses looked different, older, like they were abandoned. The streets were unfamiliar, and there was no one around. My phone buzzed again. You're almost there. The car pulled up to a house that looked like mine, but it wasn't. It was run down, the windows boarded up, the lawn overgrown. The door opened, and I hesitated, but then I saw it. In the window, a face, like the ones in the warehouse, watching me. I had no choice. I got out of the car and approached the house. As I stepped onto the porch, the front door creaked open. I took a deep breath and walked inside. The interior was dark and smelled of decay. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into darkness once more. I turned my phone's light towards the living room, and there they were. The faces, dozens of them, staring at me with their empty sockets. They were closer now, and I could see their twisted, decayed bodies. My phone buzzed again. Welcome home. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The faces were closing in, their whispers growing louder. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, their hands reaching out to me. My phone buzzed one last time. You wanted a thrill. Enjoy. The faces closed in, their decayed hands brushing against my skin. The sensation was cold and clammy, like touching something dead. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it would burst out of my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was paralyzed by fear. Then everything stopped. The faces retreated into the shadows, and the whispers faded. I was alone in the dark, the silence pressing down on me. My phone buzzed, and I nearly dropped it in surprise. The screen displayed a new message. Find the light switch. I shone the flashlight around, searching for any sign of a switch. The walls were bare, except for peeling wallpaper and a few old framed photos. I squinted at one of them, and my blood ran cold. It was a picture of my family, my parents and I, smiling in front of our house. But something was wrong. Our eyes were scratched out, replaced with those dark, empty sockets. I backed away, feeling sick to my stomach, and my foot hit something solid. I turned the light down and saw an old wooden chest. It was covered in dust, and the lock was broken. With no other options, I opened it. Inside, I found a dusty, yellowed map of the house, marked with strange symbols. One of them looked like a light switch. I followed the map through the house, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the floor creaked under my weight. I felt like I was being watched, and every now and then I caught glimpses of those faces in the corners of my vision. Finally, I found the switch. It was in a small room at the back of the house. next to an old, decrepit staircase leading to the basement. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the switch. My phone buzzed again. Turn it on. I took a deep breath and flipped the switch. The lights flickered to life, revealing the true horror of the house. The walls were covered in strange black symbols, and the floors were stained with dark, dried patches that looked disturbingly like blood. The faces were gone, but their presence lingered, like a bad smell you can't get rid of. My phone buzzed with another message. Go to the basement. My heart sank. I didn't want to go down there, but I had no choice. I had to see this through. I descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder and more oppressive the further I went. The basement was pitch black, except for the small beam of light from my phone. The smell of decay was stronger here, almost overwhelming. I gagged, covering my nose with my shirt, and continued forward. My phone buzzed again. Find the door. I scanned the room with my light and saw a small wooden door at the far end of the basement. It was old and rotting, barely hanging on its hinges. As I approached, I heard faint noises coming from the other side. It sounded like scratching and low, guttural moans. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open. Inside was a small, windowless room, and in the center was a figure, bound to a chair with thick, rusted chains. The figure was covered in a dirty, blood-stained sheet, and it was twitching and moaning softly. I felt a wave of nausea and fear wash over me, but I forced myself to step closer. My phone buzzed again. Remove the sheet. I didn't want to. Every instinct told me to run, but I knew I had to see this through. I reached out, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and pulled the sheet off. Underneath was a man, or what was left of one. His skin was pale and covered in deep, oozing wounds. His eyes were wide open, filled with terror, but he didn't seem to see me. His mouth moved, forming words that made no sound. His hands were bound to the chair, and his fingers were nothing but bloody stumps. I stumbled back, horrified, and my phone buzzed again. Feed him. I looked around the room and saw a small metal tray on the floor. On it was a bowl of something that looked like raw meat, crawling with maggots. I gagged again, but I knew I had no choice. I picked up the bowl and approached the man. His eyes followed me, desperate and pleading. I lifted a piece of the meat to his mouth, and he devoured it hungrily, making awful, wet chewing sounds. My phone buzzed again. More. I fed him piece after piece, trying not to vomit, as the stench of the rotting meat filled the room. When the bowl was empty, the man slumped forward, his eyes rolling back in his head. My phone buzzed one last time. Congratulations, you have completed the first task. I felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The door behind me slammed shut, and I was plunged into darkness again. My phone buzzed. Now, it's your turn. I turned around, and there they were. The faces, staring at me. From the shadows, their empty eyes filled with malice. They moved closer, their whispers growing louder. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped, their cold hands reaching for me, pulling me into the darkness. When I came to, I was lying on a cold stone floor. My head throbbed, and my mouth was dry. I tried to move, but my hands and feet were bound with rough ropes. I looked around and realized I was in a large, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in those same strange symbols I had seen earlier, and the air was thick with the smell of burning incense and something else, something metallic and sharp. My phone was gone. Panic set in. and I struggled against my restraints, but they were too tight. I heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. A figure emerged from the shadows, dressed in a long dark robe with a hood that concealed their face. They moved with an eerie grace, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure stopped in front of me and lowered the hood. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes dark and empty. She smiled, revealing yellowed, crooked teeth. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft and unsettling. "You've been chosen." I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry. She reached down and placed a hand on my forehead, her touch cold and clammy. "You sought out the dark web for a thrill, didn't you?" she whispered. "Well, now you've found it." She stepped back and clapped her hands. Two more figures emerged from the shadows, both dressed in the same dark robes. They approached me and began to untie the ropes, their hands rough and unkind. Once I was free, they pulled me to my feet and led me to the center of the room, where a large stone altar stood. I was forced to kneel in front of the altar, my arms held tightly by the robed figures. The woman approached again, holding a small ornate knife. The blade gleamed in the dim light, and I could see dark stains on it, all dried blood. She raised the knife and began to chant in a language I didn't understand. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse and writhe as if they were alive. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. I struggled against my captors, but their grip was ironclad. The woman finished her chant and lowered the knife, pressing the tip against my chest. "You will be the vessel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one to bring forth the darkness." I felt a sharp pain as the blade pierced my skin, and I cried out. The figures around me began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic. The pain spread through my chest, and I felt something warm and wet trickling down my skin. I was bleeding, but the woman didn't stop. She drew the knife down, carving a deep, jagged line into my flesh. My vision blurred with tears and pain, and I thought I was going to pass out. But then, something changed. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, and the air crackled with energy. I felt a strange sensation, like something was crawling under my skin, moving through my veins. The chanting grew louder, more intense. The figures around me swayed and moved in unison, their voices blending together into a single, overpowering sound. I could feel the energy building, the darkness closing in around me. Suddenly, the woman stepped back, pulling the knife from my chest. The pain was unbearable, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The chanting stopped, and the room fell silent. I lay there bleeding and broken, my body racked with pain. The woman knelt beside me and placed a hand on my forehead again. "It is done," she said softly. "You are the vessel now." She stood and stepped back, joining the other figures. They watched me with their dark, empty eyes, waiting. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew it wasn't over. I could feel something inside me, something dark and powerful, awakening. The woman raised her arms and began to chant again, her voice rising and falling in a haunting melody. The figures joined in, their voices blending together in perfect harmony. The energy in the room grew stronger, and I felt the darkness inside me spreading, taking over. I tried to fight it, but it was too powerful. I could feel my body changing, my mind slipping away. The darkness consumed me, filling every part of my being. I was no longer in control. I was a vessel, a conduit for something ancient and malevolent. The chanting reached a crescendo, and I felt a surge of energy explode from within me. The room was filled with a blinding light, and I screamed as the darkness tore through me, ripping apart my soul. When the light faded, I was no longer myself. I was something else, something dark and powerful. The figures around me knelt, their heads bowed in reverence. The woman approached again, her eyes filled with awe. "Welcome," she said softly. "Welcome to the darkness." I stood, my body moving on its own. I looked down at my hands, now twisted and blackened, and I felt a surge of power. The darkness had consumed me, and I was its vessel. I was no longer afraid. I was something more, something greater. The woman smiled and stepped back, joining the others in their reverence. I raised my hands, and the room was filled with a dark, pulsing energy. I could feel the power coursing through me, and I knew that I was no longer alone. The darkness was with me, guiding me, controlling me. I looked at the figures around me, their faces filled with fear and awe. They had brought me here, transformed me, and now they were mine to command. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction, knowing that I had become what they feared most. The darkness had claimed me, and there was no going back. I was its vessel, its conduit, and I would spread its power to the world. The woman stepped forward and bowed her head. "What is your will, master?" she asked. I looked at her, my eyes filled with the darkness, and smiled. "Bring me more," I said, my voice cold and hollow. "Bring me more vessels." The figures nodded and moved to obey. The darkness had only just begun to spread, and I was its harbinger. The world would soon know the true power of the dark web, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. I spent what felt like hours, maybe days, in that basement. The figures in the dark robes brought people to me, each one bound and terrified. They screamed, begged, and pleaded, but their cries fell on deaf ears. I was no longer human. I was a vessel for the darkness, and their suffering was my fuel. With each new victim, I felt the power inside me grow. The ritual was always the same. The chanting, the knife, the blood. The darkness would consume them, leaving behind empty shells. Their souls became part of the dark force that inhabited me, amplifying my strength. One night, as I stood in the center of the basement, surrounded by the bodies of my latest victims, I felt a shift. The air grew colder, and the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter. The robed figures knelt before me, their heads bowed in reverence. My phone, which I hadn't seen in days, buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, and the screen displayed a new message. "It is time. Spread the darkness." The words filled me with a sense of purpose. I knew what I had to do. The power within me surged, and I raised my hands, feeling the dark energy pulse through my veins. The figures around me chanted in unison, their voices blending together in a haunting melody. The basement began to tremble, and the walls seemed to pulse with dark energy. I focused my power, directing it towards the ground. The floor cracked and split, revealing a deep, dark void beneath. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and I felt the darkness spread outwards, reaching into the world above. I climbed out of the basement, the robed figures following closely behind. The house, once decayed and abandoned, now pulsed with dark energy. The darkness had consumed it, transforming it into a beacon of malevolence. As I stepped outside, I felt the cool night air on my skin. The street was empty, silent, but I could feel the darkness spreading, reaching out into the town. The robed figures followed me, their eyes empty and soulless. They were my disciples now, devoted to spreading the darkness. We moved through the town like a plague, our presence infecting everything we touched. The darkness seeped into the buildings, the streets, the very air. People began to notice, their fear growing as the darkness consumed their world. At first, they tried to fight it. They called the police, the military, but their efforts were futile. The darkness was too powerful, too pervasive. It spread like wildfire, turning the town into a nightmare. People disappeared, their screams echoing through the empty streets. I reveled in the chaos, the fear. The darkness had given me purpose, power. I was unstoppable. The robed figures continued to bring me victims, their souls fueling the spread of the dark force. One night, as I stood on a hill overlooking the town, I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see the woman from the basement, her eyes now filled with the same darkness that consumed me. "It is done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The town is ours." I looked down at the town, now shrouded in darkness. The buildings were twisted, their windows shattered. The streets were filled with shadows, moving and shifting with a life of their own. The air was thick with the stench of decay and fear. The woman stepped closer, her eyes locked on mine. "What now, master?" she asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. I smiled, feeling the darkness surge within me. "We move on," I said. "The world will know the power of the dark web." We traveled from town to town, city to city, spreading the darkness wherever we went. People tried to resist, but it was always the same. Their efforts were futile. Their screams echoed in the empty streets. The darkness consumed everything in its path, leaving behind a trail of desolation and fear. I watched as the world crumbled, the darkness spreading like a disease. The robed figures followed me, their devotion unwavering. They were my disciples, my army, and together we would bring the world to its knees. The darkness had given me power, purpose. I was no longer human. I was something greater, something more. The world would soon know the true power of the dark web, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. One night, as we approached a new city, I felt a strange sensation. The air was different, charged with a familiar energy. I realized that the city was waiting for us. It had felt the darkness approaching and was preparing for the inevitable. I stood at the edge of the city, feeling the dark energy pulse through me. The robed figures gathered around, their eyes fixed on me. "It is time," I said, my voice cold and hollow. "The world will know our power." The city fell into darkness just like the others. The people screamed, they fought, but it was always the same. The darkness consumed everything, leaving behind a twisted, desolate wasteland. As I stood in the center of the city, surrounded by the bodies of the fallen, I felt a sense of satisfaction. The darkness had spread, and the world was ours. But deep down, a small part of me wondered if there was any humanity left in me, or if I had become a monster beyond redemption. The woman from the basement approached me, her eyes filled with darkness. "What now, master?" she asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. I looked out at the city, now shrouded in darkness, and felt the power surge within me. "We continue," I said, my voice filled with determination. "The world will know our power. We will spread the darkness to every corner of the earth." And so we moved on, our path of destruction unrelenting. The world would know the true power of the dark web, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. We continued our march of darkness across the globe. leaving behind a wake of fear and desolation. Cities fell, their inhabitants consumed by the black void that followed us. The world was descending into chaos, and the darkness within me grew stronger with each passing day. One night, as we approached the outskirts of a massive metropolis, I felt something different. The air was thick with anticipation, and the dark energy within me pulsed with an almost electric excitement. The robed figures around me sensed it too, their eyes glinting with the same malevolent glee that I felt. We entered the city, and for the first time, I encountered resistance. Not from people, but from something else. There was an energy here that was different, something that pushed back against the darkness. I felt it as a faint pressure, a whisper of light that dared to defy the void. My phone, which had been silent for days, buzzed with a new message. Find the source. The words filled me with a sense of urgency. This city held something that threatened the darkness, and it was my duty to snuff it out. We moved through the city, the robed figures and I, our presence causing streetlights to flicker and die. The people we encountered screamed and fled, but their fear was different. There was a defiance in their eyes, a flicker of hope that I hadn't seen before. The whispers of light grew stronger as we moved deeper into the city. I could feel it, a beacon of resistance against the dark. My disciples and I followed the energy, drawn to it like moths to a flame. Finally, we reached a massive old cathedral at the heart of the city. The cathedral's doors were wide open, and a warm golden light spilled out into the night. It was beautiful, almost blinding in its intensity. I hesitated at the threshold, feeling the darkness within me recoil from the light, but I had come too far to turn back now. We entered the cathedral, the light growing stronger with each step. The robed figures flanked me, their faces hidden in the shadows of their hoods. At the center of the cathedral, bathed in golden light, stood a figure in white robes. Their face was serene, eyes closed, hands raised as if in prayer. The light emanated from the figure, pushing back against the darkness. I felt a surge of anger and fear. This was the source of resistance, the force that dared to defy the darkness. My phone buzzed with a final message. Destroy the light. I approached the figure, the robed disciples at my side. The figure opened their eyes, and I saw not fear, but sadness and pity. They lowered their hands and spoke, their voice calm and soothing. You do not have to do this, they said. There is still hope for you. You can choose the light. The words struck something deep within me, a faint echo of the person I once was. But the darkness surged, drowning out the flicker of humanity. I raised my hands, summoning the dark energy that had consumed me. The robed figures around me chanted, their voices a dark, discordant melody. The figure in white stood their ground, the light around them intensifying. I felt the darkness within me rage against the light, a violent clash of forces. The cathedral trembled, the walls cracking under the pressure of the opposing energies. With a roar, I unleashed the full power of the darkness, a black wave that surged towards the figure. The light flared in response, meeting the darkness head-on. The clash of energies was deafening, a cataclysmic explosion that shook the very foundations of the city. For a moment, everything was chaos, light and dark intertwined, battling for dominance. I felt the darkness within me waver, a small flickering ember of light fighting to break free. The figure in white stepped forward, their eyes locked on mine, and I saw not just pity, but understanding. "You are not lost," they whispered, their voice cutting through the roar of the battle. "You can still choose." The words pierced through the darkness, reaching something deep inside me. I felt a tear roll down my cheek, the first sign of humanity I had shown in months. The light surged, and for a brief moment I was free. I was myself again, but the darkness was strong, relentless. It fought back, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I looked at the figure in white, my vision blurring with tears. "Help me," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure reached out, their hand glowing with golden light. I felt their touch, warm and comforting, and for a moment the darkness receded. But it was not enough. The darkness was too strong, too deeply rooted. With a final surge of power, the light and dark collided, and I felt myself being torn apart. The world around me dissolved into blinding light and suffocating darkness, and I screamed, a sound that was lost in the maelstrom. When the chaos finally subsided, I found myself lying on the cold stone floor of the cathedral. The robed figures were gone. The dark energy dissipated. The figure in white knelt beside me, their face kind and gentle. "You are free now," they said softly. "The darkness has been defeated." I looked at them, my heart filled with gratitude and sorrow. The darkness had taken so much from me, but in the end, I had found a small glimmer of redemption. I closed my eyes, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. The world was safe, for now, but I knew that the darkness would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for a chance to return. And I would be ready, a guardian against the void, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. I bought parents from the dark web. 2 men in black showed at my door. So this is something I have been keeping to myself for a while, but I need to get it off my chest. I've made some really messed up choices, and now I don't know how to get out of this. Please bear with me, because this might sound insane. I'm a 16-year-old kid, living alone in this crappy apartment. My real parents died in a car accident 2 years ago. I was put in foster care, but let's just say it didn't work out. The people were either neglectful or just in it for the money. I ran away and have been squatting ever since. It's not ideal, but I get by. Anyway, I spend a lot of time on the internet. One night, while diving deep into the weird corners of the web, I found this forum. People were talking about something called the market. It's like the dark web, but creepier. They say you can get anything there. Drugs, weapons, hitmen, organs, you name it. But one post caught my eye. It said, "Buy parents." I clicked on it out of morbid curiosity. The post was long and detailed. It talked about how they could provide you with custom parents. You could choose their looks, personalities, even their memories. It sounded like some sick joke, but there was a link, and being the idiot that I am, I clicked it. The site was minimalistic, just a black screen with a few options. It asked for my preferences, age, gender, appearance, everything. I thought, what the hell, and filled it out. I wanted a mom who looked like my real one. Blonde hair, blue eyes, kind face. For a dad, I just chose someone who looked strong and dependable. After I submitted the form, I was prompted to pay with Bitcoin. It was a ridiculous amount of money. I didn't have that kind of cash, but the site accepted payment plans. Again, being stupid, I agreed. I didn't think it would actually work. A week passed, then another. I forgot about it, convinced it was just a scam. Until one night, around 3 a.m., There was a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially at that hour. My heart raced as I tiptoed to the door. I peered through the peephole, and my blood turned to ice. Two men, dressed in black suits, stood outside. They looked like FBI agents or something, but way more sinister. I hesitated, but they didn't leave. Finally, one of them said, "We have your delivery." Shaking, I opened the door just a crack. They pushed it open and stepped inside, towering over me. One of them handed me a manila envelope. Inside were documents, photos, and 2 keys. The other guy just smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that makes your skin crawl. "Your parents are downstairs," he said. "They're waiting for you." I didn't know what to say. My mind was spinning. I just nodded dumbly. The men turned and left, leaving me in shock. I stood there for what felt like forever. Then finally, I took the keys and went downstairs. In the lobby, 2 people were standing there, looking around like they were lost. A woman, just like I had described, and a man. They turned and smiled when they saw me, but something was off. Their smiles were too perfect, too mechanical. "Hi, honey," the woman said. Her voice was sweet but hollow. "We've missed you so much." I just stared. I couldn't believe it. They walked up to me and hugged me. Their bodies were warm, but their eyes were empty, like they weren't really there. I brought them back to my apartment, my mind reeling. They acted normal enough, talking about how happy they were to see me, how much they loved me, but it was like they were reading from a script. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to them move around the apartment. Around midnight, I heard whispers. I got up and crept to their room. The door was ajar, and I peeked inside. They were standing in the middle of the room, facing each other. Their eyes were closed, and they were whispering in some language I didn't understand. It didn't sound human. It was guttural, like growls mixed with hisses. My stomach churned, and I backed away, trying not to make a sound. I went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept hearing those whispers in my head. The next morning, they were back to normal, acting like nothing happened, but I couldn't look at them the same way. Days turned into weeks. They did everything parents are supposed to do. Cooked, cleaned, took care of me. But it was all wrong. Their movements were too smooth. Their smiles too perfect. I started to feel like I was living with robots. One night, I woke up to the sound of crying. I followed the noise to the kitchen. There, my mom was standing, tears streaming down her face. But she wasn't making any noise, just tears, flowing endlessly. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She turned to me, and her eyes were dead. No emotion, no life. "I'm sorry," she said. "We have to." Before I could ask what she meant, she lunged at me, grabbing my arm with a grip like iron. I screamed and tried to pull away, but she was too strong. My dad appeared, holding a syringe. He jabbed it into my neck, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was in my bed. My arm was bruised where she had grabbed me, and my neck ached. They acted like nothing had happened, but I knew it wasn't a dream. I felt a cold lump in my stomach. I was trapped with these things, whatever they were. That's when I decided I had to find out the truth. I waited until they were asleep, then snuck into their room. I found the documents they had brought with them. Birth certificates, marriage license. Everything seemed legit. but at the bottom of the pile was a sheet of paper with strange symbols on it. It looked like some kind of contract, written in that same guttural language. I took pictures of everything and hid them on my phone. The next day, I skipped school and went to the library. I spent hours researching, trying to find anything about those symbols. Finally, I found a match in an old book about occult practices. The symbols were part of a ritual, one that binds spirits to human forms. I felt sick. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go to the police. Who would believe me? I was on my own, with these monsters pretending to be my parents. That night, I decided to confront them. I waited until they were in the living room, then walked in, holding the pictures. "What are you?" I demanded. They looked at each other, then back at me. Their eyes seemed to darken, and their smiles faded. "We are your parents," my dad said. His voice was cold. "No, you're not," I snapped. "I know about the ritual. I know you're not human." They stood up, and I backed away, my heart pounding. "You shouldn't have done that," my mom said, her voice a low growl. I ran to my room and locked the door. They pounded on it, shouting in that guttural language. I blocked it with my dresser and sat on my bed, shaking. I didn't know how long I could keep this up, but I knew one thing. I had to get out of there before it was too late. I barely slept that night. Every noise made me jump, convinced they were about to break down the door and do God knows what to me. I spent the night with my back against the door, clutching a kitchen knife for what little comfort it provided. When morning finally came, I felt like a zombie, but I knew I had to act. They were eerily calm the next day, as if nothing had happened. They smiled and asked about breakfast, but I could see it in their eyes. They knew I was scared, and they liked it. I played along, forcing myself to smile back, all while planning my escape. I decided to skip school again. Instead, I went to the nearest internet cafe. I needed to figure out what exactly these things were and how to get rid of them. My phone buzzed with messages from the school and a few from concerned classmates, but I ignored them. I was in survival mode now. I went back to the forums where I first found the market. I posted a desperate message asking if anyone knew anything about the ritual or the symbols. The responses were slow at first, mostly trolls and people calling me an idiot. But then I got a private message from someone named Watcher. Watcher claimed to know about the ritual. He said it was ancient, used to bind malevolent spirits to human forms. The spirits could mimic human behavior perfectly, but were always waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature. He warned me that they wouldn't just let me go. Once the ritual was complete, the spirits considered their host family to be their rightful property. Escape was nearly impossible. I asked him how to break the ritual. He said there were only two ways: perform a counter-ritual to banish them or destroy their human forms. The problem was the counter-ritual required materials that were almost impossible to find. It was a dead end. That left the second option, which made my stomach churn. I couldn't kill them. They looked so much like my real parents that the thought made me sick, but I knew I couldn't stay with them. I thanked Watcher and logged off, feeling more lost than ever. I spent the next few days in a haze. Every moment with them felt like walking on a tightrope. They seemed to sense my fear, growing more bold and less careful with their facades. I started noticing small things, the way their skin would sometimes ripple like something was moving underneath. or how their eyes would momentarily go completely black when they thought I wasn't looking. One night, I overheard them talking again in that strange language. This time, I understood a few words thanks to my research. They were talking about a harvest and feeding. My blood ran cold. Whatever they were planning, it was going to happen soon. That's when I decided to run. I packed a small bag with essentials, clothes, some money I'd been saving, and the documents I'd found. I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment. It was only a matter of time before they made their move. I planned to leave early in the morning, before they woke up, but things didn't go as planned. Around 3 a.m., I heard a loud crash. My heart leapt into my throat. I grabbed my bag and the knife and crept towards the door. My dad was standing in the hallway, blocking my path. His eyes were completely black, and his smile was gone. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice dripping with malice. I backed away, clutching the knife. "Get out of my way," I said, trying to sound brave but failing miserably. He took a step forward. "You're not leaving," he said. "You belong to us now." I didn't wait for him to get any closer. I ran back to my room and slammed the door, but he was right behind me. He started pounding on the door, the wood splintering under his fists. I screamed, feeling utterly helpless. My mom appeared behind him, her face twisted in a grotesque smile. Then out of nowhere, a deafening noise filled the apartment. It was like a siren, but much worse. They both froze, their eyes widening in fear. I took the chance and bolted out of my room, pushing past them. I ran out of the apartment and down the stairs, not stopping until I was outside and several blocks away. I didn't know where to go, so I just kept running. Eventually, I found an all-night diner and collapsed into a booth, shaking and gasping for breath. The waitress gave me a strange look, but didn't say anything. I ordered a coffee and tried to collect my thoughts. I knew I couldn't go back, but I also knew I couldn't stay on the run forever. I needed help, and I needed it fast. Watcher's words echoed in my mind. "They won't let you go." I logged onto the cafe's Wi-Fi and messaged Watcher, telling him what had happened. He replied almost immediately, saying he could help me, but I needed to get to a safe place first. He gave me an address and told me to meet him there the next night. I spent the rest of the day hiding out in the diner, jumping at every noise. When night fell, I made my way to the address Watcher had given me. It was an old rundown house on the outskirts of the town. The windows were boarded up, and it looked abandoned, but I had no other options. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it creaked open. A man in his 40s stood there, looking me over. He had a weary, haunted look in his eyes. "You must be the kid," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "I'm Watcher." The house was dark and smelled of mildew. He led me to a small room with a single flickering light bulb. There were books and papers scattered everywhere. He motioned for me to sit down. "Tell me everything," he said. I poured out the whole story, from finding the forum to the night I ran away. He listened intently, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he leaned back and sighed. "This is worse than I thought," he said. "Those things aren't just spirits. They're demons, and they've marked you." "Marked me?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. He nodded. "When they did the ritual, they claimed your soul. That's why they won't let you go. You're their link to this world. As long as they have you, they can stay here." I felt like I was going to be sick. "So what do I do?" He looked at me, with a mixture of pity and determination. "We're going to break the ritual," he said, "but it's going to be dangerous. Are you ready for that?" I didn't have a choice. I nodded, even though I was terrified. He handed me a small silver knife and a vial of some dark liquid. "This is going to get messy," he said, "but it's the only way." I took a deep breath and followed him. I had no idea what I was in for, but I knew one thing. I had to survive. I couldn't let those things win. Watcher's house was filled with a sense of foreboding. The air felt thick and oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I followed Watcher down a narrow hallway, his flashlight casting eerie shadows that danced on the peeling wallpaper. We entered a small room that looked like a mix between a library and a laboratory. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with ancient books, jars of strange substances, and occult artifacts. "We have to act quickly," Watcher said, motioning for me to sit at a cluttered table. "They'll come looking for you." "How do you know all this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I used to be part of a group that dealt with these kinds of entities," he replied, not meeting my eyes. "We studied them, tried to find ways to stop them. Most of us didn't make it." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to focus. "What do we do now?" Watcher pulled out an old leather-bound book and flipped through the pages. The symbols looked similar to the ones on the contract I had found. He stopped at a page with a detailed diagram and strange incantations. "This is the counter ritual," he explained. "We need to perform it exactly as written, or it won't work, and you need to be ready to defend yourself." He handed me the silver knife and the vial of dark liquid again. "The knife is for protection," he said. "If they get too close, use it." The liquid is a mixture of herbs and other substances that can weaken them. It won't kill them, but it will buy us some time. I nodded, trying to steady my trembling hands. Watcher began drawing the symbols on the floor with chalk, muttering incantations under his breath. The room felt colder with each passing minute, and I could sense a presence growing stronger. "Stand in the center of the circle," he instructed. "Whatever happens, don't step out of it." I did as he said, clutching the knife tightly. Watcher lit several candles and placed them around the circle, their flickering flames casting long shadows. He began chanting in that guttural language, the words resonating deep within me. The air grew thick with energy, and I felt a strange pull, like something was trying to drag me out of the circle. Suddenly, the room shook, and a deafening roar filled the air. The candles flickered violently, threatening to go out. I glanced around, my heart pounding. The walls seemed to pulse, and I could hear whispers, the same ones I had heard from my parents. "They're here!" Watcher shouted over the noise. "Stay focused!" The front door crashed open, and I heard heavy footsteps approaching. My parents appeared in the doorway, their faces twisted in rage. Their eyes were black voids, and their movements were jerky and unnatural. "You can't stop us," my dad growled, his voice a deep, menacing rumble. "He belongs to us." I raised the knife, my hand shaking. "Stay back," I warned, though my voice was far from steady. They advanced, ignoring my threat. My mom lunged at me, her hands clawed and reaching. I slashed at her with the knife, the blade cutting through her skin like paper. She screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman wail, and staggered back. Watcher continued his chanting, his voice rising in intensity. The symbols on the floor began to glow, and a strange dark mist seeped from the walls. My parents recoiled, their faces contorted with fear and pain. "It's working," Watcher yelled. "Keep them at bay." I swung the knife again as my dad tried to enter the circle. The blade barely grazed him, but it was enough to make him retreat. The mist thickened, swirling around the room like a living thing. My parents screamed and writhed, their bodies flickering like a faulty hologram. The room shook violently, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. I felt a pressure building inside me, like my head was about to explode. Watcher's chanting reached a fever pitch, and the symbols on the floor blazed with light. With a final, agonizing scream, my parents disintegrated into the mist, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The room fell silent, and the oppressive weight lifted. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Watcher helped me up, his face pale and sweaty. "It's over," he said, his voice shaky. "For now." I looked around, the room still spinning. "What do you mean, for now?" "They're gone, but the mark is still on you," he explained. "We need to remove it, or they'll find a way back." I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. "How do we do that?" he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "There's another ritual, but it's even more dangerous than the one we just did. We'll need more materials, and we'll have to be prepared for anything." I nodded, feeling a mix of fear and determination. "I'll do whatever it takes." Watcher gave me a grim smile. "Good. We'll need to move quickly. Gather your strength. We have a long night ahead of us." As I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over, and I had no idea what other horrors awaited us. But one thing was clear: I wasn't alone anymore, and together we would find a way to break free from this nightmare. I barely had time to catch my breath before Watcher started gathering more supplies. He handed me a list, scrawled in barely legible handwriting. "We need everything on this list," he said. "No exceptions." I glanced at the list, my heart sinking. It included items like grave dirt, a lock of hair from a newborn, and several herbs I'd never heard of. "Where am I supposed to get this stuff?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed. Watcher gave me a hard look. "The dark web. You know how to navigate it, right?" I nodded, my stomach churning. I didn't have any other options. I needed to end this, once and for all. Watcher gave me a laptop, and I settled into a corner of the room, connecting to the internet. Hours passed as I trawled through forums and marketplaces, contacting shady sellers and arranging deliveries. The prices were astronomical, but I had no choice. I used every bit of money I had saved and even borrowed from some of Watcher's contacts. By the time I was done, I felt drained, both mentally and financially. We spent the next few days waiting for the deliveries, on edge the entire time. I barely slept, jumping at every noise. Watcher tried to keep me calm, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He knew as well as I did that time was running out. The first package arrived 3 days later. It was a small box, wrapped in black paper. Inside were vials of herbs and a small bag of grave dirt. The other items trickled in over the next few days, each one adding to the growing sense of dread. Finally, we had everything we needed. Watcher cleared a space in the center of the room and began drawing another circle, this one even more complex than the last. He placed the items at specific points around the circle, muttering incantations under his breath. "This is it," he said, looking up at me. "Once we start, there's no turning back. Are you ready?" I nodded, though I felt anything but ready. "Let's do it." Watcher lit the candles and handed me a small ornate bowl. "You need to cut your hand and let the blood drip into this," he instructed. "It will bind the ritual to you." I took a deep breath and sliced my palm with the silver knife. The pain was sharp, but I gritted my teeth and let the blood flow into the bowl. Watcher mixed it with the herbs and other substances, creating a thick, dark paste. He began chanting again, the words filling the room with an eerie resonance. The symbols on the floor started to glow, and the air grew heavy. I stood in the center of the circle, feeling the energy build around me. As Watcher continued the ritual, the room grew colder. I could see my breath, and the candles flickered violently. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, taking on sinister shapes. I felt a pressure building in my chest, like something was trying to tear its way out. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the two men in black suits stormed in. Their faces were blank, devoid of any emotion. "You shouldn't have meddled," one of them said, his voice flat and lifeless. Watcher didn't stop chanting. He looked at me and shouted, "Hold them off. I'm almost done." I grabbed the silver knife and faced the men, my heart pounding. They moved with unnatural speed, their movements jerky and robotic. One of them lunged at me, and I slashed at him with the knife. The blade cut through his suit, revealing a mass of writhing shadows beneath. He recoiled, his face contorting in anger. The other man came at me from the side, and I barely managed to dodge his attack. I swung the knife again, cutting deep into his arm. The shadows spilled out, hissing and writhing on the floor. They both backed off, glaring at me with those empty eyes. "You can't stop us," the first man said. "We will have you." I felt a surge of determination. "Not if I have anything to say about it." The room shook violently, and the symbols on the floor blazed with light. Watcher's chanting reached a crescendo, and the dark paste in the bowl began to bubble and steam. The pressure in my chest intensified, and I felt like I was being pulled apart. With a final, deafening roar, the ritual reached its peak. The men in black screamed, their forms dissolving into shadows. The symbols on the floor burned bright, and the dark paste exploded into a cloud of smoke. I fell to the floor, gasping for breath. The room was filled with a strange, oppressive silence. I looked up and saw Watcher slumped against the wall, looking exhausted but triumphant. "It's done," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The mark is gone." I felt a weight lift off my chest, and I knew he was right. The presence that had been haunting me was gone. I was free. Watcher helped me to my feet, and we stood there in the wreckage of the room, both of us breathing heavily. "What now?" I asked, my voice shaky. He gave me a tired smile. "Now, you start over. But this time, you're not alone." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The nightmare was finally over, but I knew the scars would remain. I had a long road ahead of me, but at least now I had someone to help me navigate it. As we left the house, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. The shadows seemed to linger, watching us go, but I knew, deep down, that I would never let them control me again. Leaving Watcher's house felt like stepping out of a nightmare and into a fragile reality. We walked in silence for a while, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy between us. I could still feel the cold grip of fear, but it was different now. It wasn't the paralyzing terror I'd felt before. It was a wary vigilance, the kind that comes from knowing that monsters are real and they wear human faces. Watcher took me to a small, dingy motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one asks questions. He paid for a week in cash and handed me the key. "You need to lay low for a while," he said. "They might be gone, but it's best to be careful." I nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and helplessness. "What about you?" I asked. He shrugged. "I'll be around. I have to make sure they don't come back. And I need to keep researching. There's always more to learn." We said our goodbyes, and I watched him disappear into the night. I felt a pang of loneliness, but also a strange sense of hope. I wasn't alone anymore. I had an ally, someone who understood what I was going through, and that made all the difference. The motel room was small and bare, but it felt like a sanctuary. I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle, just to be safe. Then I collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion finally overtaking me. I slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures and guttural whispers. The next few days were a blur. I stayed in the room, venturing out only to get food from the nearby convenience store. I spent hours online, reading everything I could about the occult and the rituals we had performed. I wanted to understand, to make sure I was prepared if anything ever happened again. One evening, there was a knock at my door. My heart leapt into my throat. I grabbed the silver knife from under my pillow and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice trembling. "It's Watcher," came the reply. I felt a wave of relief and opened the door. He stepped inside, looking haggard and worn. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. "I've found something." We sat down at the small table in the corner of the room. He pulled out a notebook filled with handwritten notes and sketches. "I've been looking into the symbols we saw during the ritual," he explained. "I think they're part of a larger pattern, something much older and more dangerous." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Watcher flipped through the pages, showing me diagrams and translations. "These symbols are part of an ancient binding ritual," he said. "It's meant to trap spirits and demons, but there's a darker aspect to it. It can also be used to summon them." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Summon them? Why would anyone do that?" He sighed. "Power, control, immortality, the usual reasons, but there's more. I think the people behind the market are trying to use these rituals to create an army of bound spirits. They're looking for vulnerable people like you, to use as hosts." I felt sick. "So they're not just random entities, they're being controlled." Watcher nodded. "Exactly. And if we don't stop them, more people will end up like you. Or worse." A heavy silence settled over us. I realized that this was bigger than just my own survival. There were others out there, other kids who might fall into the same trap. I couldn't let that happen. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. "We need to find the source," Watcher said. "Destroy the organization behind the market. But we can't do it alone. We need help." He pulled out a burner phone and handed it to me. "I've contacted a few old friends," he said. "People who know about this kind of stuff. They're willing to help, but we need to be careful. Trust no one." I took the phone, feeling a sense of resolve. "Okay, let's do this." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Watcher and I moved from place to place, staying off the grid as much as possible. We met with his contacts, each one bringing a piece of the puzzle. A hacker who could trace the origins of the market, a former cult member who knew the rituals inside out, an ex-cop who had seen things that defied explanation. Together, we formed a plan. It was risky, and the odds were against us, but it was our only chance. We would infiltrate the market, find the people in charge, and destroy their operation from the inside. The night of the operation, I felt a strange mix of fear and determination. We gathered in an abandoned warehouse, going over the plan one last time. Watcher handed me the silver knife, now inscribed with protective runes. "Stay close," he said, "and remember, they're not invincible. We can do this." I nodded, gripping the knife tightly. We moved out, slipping through the shadows toward our target. The building was nondescript, just another run-down office in a forgotten part of town. But inside, it was a different story. We breached the door and were met with a scene straight out of a nightmare. The walls were covered in symbols, and the air was thick with the stench of blood and decay. Figures in black robes moved about, chanting in that guttural language. At the center of the room was an altar surrounded by bound spirits. "Now!" Watcher shouted, and we sprang into action. The next few minutes were a blur of chaos and violence. We fought our way through the room, disrupting the ritual and breaking the bindings on the spirits. The air crackled with energy, and the building shook as the spirits were released. I found myself face to face with the leader, a tall man with eyes like black holes. "You can't stop us," he hissed, his voice echoing with otherworldly power. "We'll see about that," I snarled, and drove the knife into his chest. He screamed, a sound that pierced my very soul, and then he was gone, dissolved into nothingness. The remaining cultists fled, and the building fell silent. We had done it. The ritual was broken, and the market was no more. But the cost had been high. Watcher lay on the floor, bleeding from a deep wound. I rushed to his side, my heart pounding. "Stay with me," I pleaded, tears streaming down my face. He gave me a weak smile. "You did good, kid," he whispered. "Keep fighting. Don't let them win." I held his hand as he took his last breath, feeling a profound sense of loss. But I knew he was right. The fight wasn't over. There were still people out there, people who needed help. I stood up, the weight of my new reality settling on my shoulders. I wasn't just a kid anymore. I was a survivor, a fighter, and I would keep fighting for Watcher, for myself, and for everyone else who had fallen victim to the darkness. As I walked out of the building and into the dawn, I felt a strange sense of peace. The shadows were still there, but they didn't control me anymore. I was free, and I was ready to face whatever came next. I bought plane tickets for Disneyland from the dark web. We saw the dark side of Disneyland no one knows about. Hey Reddit, this is gonna sound absolutely insane, but I need to share this because I can't sleep. My name's Ryan, and about a month ago, I did something really stupid. I bought plane tickets to Disneyland from the dark web. Yeah, I know, it sounds sketchy as hell, but they were dirt cheap, and I thought, what could go wrong? My girlfriend Emma and I were desperate for a vacation and couldn't afford regular tickets. Little did we know, we were in for the most terrifying experience of our lives. It all started when I stumbled across a forum on the dark web offering ridiculously cheap vacation packages. I was skeptical at first, but curiosity got the better of me. The seller had a ton of positive reviews and even a guarantee that everything would be legit. So I went for it. A few days later, 2 plane tickets and Disneyland passes arrived in the mail. They looked genuine. holograms and all. I should have trusted my gut feeling that something was off, but I didn't. We flew out a week later. The flight was fine, nothing out of the ordinary. We landed in LA and took a cab to the hotel the seller had booked for us. It was an old, run-down place, a few miles from Disneyland. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie. The receptionist gave us a key to a room that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. There were stains on the carpet and a weird smell in the air, but we were too tired to care. We crashed for the night, eager to hit the park the next morning. The next day, we arrived at Disneyland early. The park was already buzzing with activity, families with kids running around. Everyone seemed so happy. We handed over our tickets at the gate, and to my surprise, they scanned without a hitch. We were in. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. We went on all the rides, ate way too much junk food, and even bought some overpriced souvenirs. Then things started to get weird. It began when we were in line for the Haunted Mansion. I noticed a man staring at us from a distance. He was tall, wearing a black hoodie despite the heat, and his eyes, they were just off. Too wide, too intense. I shrugged it off as paranoia, and we got on the ride. But when we exited, he was there again, closer this time, just standing and staring. "Did you see that guy?" I asked Emma. She nodded, looking uneasy. "Maybe he's just a park employee or something," she suggested, but I could tell she didn't believe it any more than I did. We decided to shake it off and headed to Space Mountain. That's when we noticed the park seemed different. We were led down a side path by a staff member, supposedly to avoid a long line. But this path took us away from the crowds, through narrow corridors and dimly lit areas that didn't seem part of the public space. Emma squeezed my hand tighter as we walked, her eyes darting around nervously. Finally, we emerged in what looked like an abandoned section of the park. The rides were old, rusted, and there was a deafening silence. No laughter, no music, just an eerie stillness. "This isn't right," Emma whispered, and I couldn't agree more. We turned around to go back, but the staff member who led us there was gone. Panic started to set in. We wandered around, trying to find our way back, but every path seemed to loop back into the abandoned area. It was like the park was alive, and it didn't want us to leave. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows. "What the hell was that?" Emma gasped, gripping my arm. My heart was pounding as we slowly backed away from the sound. Then out of the darkness, we saw them. Figures moving, crawling on all fours, their eyes reflecting the dim light like animals. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted down the nearest path. The growls grew louder, closer. I glanced back and saw them, twisted, deformed figures chasing us. They were human, but not. Their limbs were elongated, their faces contorted in grotesque expressions. We stumbled upon a small building and ducked inside, slamming the door behind us. It was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of decay. I fumbled for a light switch, and when I found it, the flickering fluorescent light revealed the horrors within. The walls were covered in photos, hundreds of them, all of people who looked terrified, some even mutilated. In the center of the room was a table, and on it, blood-stained tools. Emma let out a choked sob, and I pulled her close, trying to keep it together. We needed to get out, but the creatures were right outside. I scanned the room for another exit, my eyes landing on a trapdoor in the floor. We pried it open and climbed down to a narrow, damp tunnel. Crawling through the tunnel was like something out of a nightmare. The walls were closing in, the air was suffocating, and the sounds from above seemed to follow us. Finally, we emerged into another part of the park, one that was thankfully populated with other tourists. We looked disheveled and terrified, drawing concerned looks from people around us. We made a beeline for the exit, not stopping until we were outside the gates. We flagged down a cab and headed straight for the airport, not even bothering to get our stuff from the hotel. On the way, I checked my phone. There were no photos, no videos, nothing to prove what we had seen. It was like the park had erased everything. Emma and I haven't spoken much about that day since we got back. We tried to tell our friends, but they just laughed it off, saying we were probably just in some haunted attraction. But I know what we saw. Disneyland has a dark side, one that they keep hidden from the world. I don't know who those people were or what they wanted, but I'm never setting foot in that park again. So, if you ever find cheap tickets on the dark web, do yourself a favor and pass. Some deals aren't worth the price. Hey Reddit, it's Ryan again. After posting part 1, I've been flooded with messages asking for more details, and honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around everything that happened. Emma's been having nightmares, and I can't shake this feeling of being watched. Here's what happened next, after we escaped from that hellish version of Disneyland. We got home and tried to go back to normal, but the experience left us both paranoid and jumpy. Emma insisted we contact the authorities, but without any proof, it felt pointless. Besides, who would believe us? We decided to let it go, but weird things started happening almost immediately. About a week after we returned, I noticed a black SUV parked across the street from our apartment. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then it was there every day. I'd leave for work, and it would be there. I'd come home, and it would be there. Emma started seeing it too. She joked that we had our own personal FBI surveillance, but I could tell she was scared. One night, around 2 a.m., we were jolted awake by a loud banging on our front door. My heart was racing as I crept towards the door, peeking through the peephole. No one was there. But then, I noticed something on the ground outside, a small blood-stained teddy bear. I quickly brought it inside and showed it to Emma. Her face turned white. "This is sick," she whispered. "Who would do this?" We debated calling the cops, but again, what could we say? Instead, we decided to install some security cameras around the apartment. At least that way, we'd have evidence if something else happened. The next few days were quiet, but the feeling of being watched never left. Then one night, as we were reviewing the camera footage, we saw something that made my blood run cold. At around 3 a.m., a figure appeared at our front door. It was the same man from Disneyland, the one with the wide, intense eyes. He stood there for a few minutes, just staring at the door, before placing something on the ground and walking away. We rushed to the door and found a note. It simply read, "You saw too much. Stay silent." That was it. No signature, nothing. Emma was shaking, and I felt a mix of fear and rage. Who were these people, and why were they targeting us? We decided we couldn't stay there any longer. We packed a few bags and went to stay with Emma's parents in a small town a few hours away. We thought we'd be safe there, but we were wrong. A few nights into our stay, we heard noises coming from the backyard. Emma's dad grabbed his shotgun and went to check it out. He found nothing but a broken garden gnome and some strange symbols carved into the ground. They looked like something out of occult movie circles, with weird runes inside them. We called the local sheriff, but he just brushed it off as kids playing pranks. We tried to relax, but the tension was eating us alive. Then Emma's younger brother, Jake, started acting weird. He's only 10, and he'd been having nightmares about monsters in the park since we arrived. One night, he woke up screaming and claimed he saw people outside his window. We checked, but of course, there was no one there. Things escalated quickly. Jake became more withdrawn, barely eating or speaking. One night, Emma found him in the backyard, trying to carve the same symbols we saw earlier into the ground with a stick. His eyes were glazed over, and he didn't respond when we called his name. It was like he was in a trance. We managed to snap him out of it, but he couldn't remember anything afterward. That's when we knew we had to dig deeper. I started researching the dark side of Disneyland, and what I found was disturbing. There were rumors and conspiracy theories about hidden sections of the park, secret societies, and even human sacrifices. Most of it sounded like nonsense, but after what we experienced, I was willing to believe anything. I reached out to some of the people I found online who had similar stories. Most of them were too scared to talk, but a few shared their experiences. They talked about being followed, receiving threats, and having their lives ruined. One guy even claimed his friend disappeared after visiting the park and was never seen again. Emma and I decided we couldn't run forever. We had to confront this head on. We gathered all the evidence we had, the security footage, the notes, the photos of the symbols, and went to the police again. This time, we found a detective who actually listened. He was skeptical, but agreed to investigate. For a while, things seemed to calm down. The SUV disappeared, and we started to feel a bit safer. But then, the detective called with some shocking news. The man we saw at Disneyland, he was identified as an ex-employee who had been missing for years. The police found his body in a shallow grave not far from the park. He had been dead for months, possibly longer. So who was the man who followed us? And what did he want? We're still trying to piece everything together, but one thing is clear. We're in way over our heads. Emma and I are more determined than ever to get to the bottom of this, but we're scared. Whatever is behind this is powerful, and they don't want their secrets exposed. If anyone out there has experienced anything similar or has any information, please reach out. We need all the help we can get. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about stopping whatever dark forces are at play behind the happiest place on earth. Hey Reddit, it's Ryan again. Thanks for all the support and advice after the last post. Emma and I are still shaken, but we're trying to push through. This whole thing is far from over, and I feel like we're only scratching the surface of something much darker. Here's what happened next. After the police found out the man following us was actually dead, we didn't know what to think. It felt like we were trapped in a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. The detective we talked to, Detective Harris, seemed genuinely interested in helping us. He said he'd seen some weird cases in his time, but nothing like this. He promised to keep digging and keep us informed. Meanwhile, Emma and I decided to stay with her parents for a bit longer, just to be safe. But things didn't stay calm for long. One night, we were all having dinner when the power went out. It was pitch black, and the house suddenly felt like a coffin. We used our phones to light candles, and Emma's dad went to check the fuse box. As we waited, I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. I signaled everyone to stay quiet and crept to the window. There, in the dim light of the street lamp, I saw them again, the same deformed figures from Disneyland, lurking around the yard. My heart was pounding in my chest. How did they find us here? Emma's dad came back, muttering something about a blown fuse, but I grabbed his arm and whispered what I saw. He grabbed his shotgun, and we locked all the doors and windows. We huddled together in the living room, the shadows from the candles dancing on the walls, making everything feel even more surreal. Then we heard it, a soft tapping on the window. Jake started to cry, and Emma's mom held him close, trying to calm him down. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Emma and I exchanged a terrified glance. We needed to do something. But what? We were trapped. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, replaced by a low, growling noise. It sounded like it was coming from inside the house. We all froze, straining our ears to pinpoint the source. Emma's dad motioned for us to stay put and slowly made his way towards the kitchen where the noise seemed to be coming from. He disappeared into the darkness, and we held our breath, waiting. The growling grew louder, more menacing, then a scream, guttural and filled with pain. We rushed towards the sound, and what we saw will haunt me forever. Emma's dad was lying on the kitchen floor, blood pooling around him. One of those creatures was on top of him, tearing into his flesh with long, sharp claws. Its face was twisted into a grotesque mask of hunger and rage. I grabbed a knife from the counter and lunged at it, stabbing it in the side. It let out an ear-piercing screech and turned to face me, its eyes burning with malevolence. Emma grabbed a frying pan and swung it at the creature's head, knocking it off balance. We managed to drag her dad away and barricade ourselves in the bathroom. He was bleeding heavily, and we did our best to stop the flow, but it was clear he needed medical attention. The growling and screeching continued outside the door, the creatures trying to break in. We called 911, but the line was dead. We were on our own. Emma's dad was fading fast, and we knew we had to get out of there. We waited for what felt like hours until the noise outside stopped. Slowly, we opened the door and peeked out. The creatures were gone, but the house was trashed. We didn't waste any time. We grabbed what we could and rushed to the car, driving away as fast as possible. We took her dad to the nearest hospital. The doctors were able to stabilize him, but they had no idea what had attacked him. They called the police, and we gave our statements, but it felt like no one believed us. Detective Harris arrived and assured us he'd keep investigating, but his eyes told me he was just as lost as we were. Emma and I knew we couldn't stay in one place for long. These things, whatever they were hunting us. We decided to keep moving, never staying in one spot for more than a night or two. We bought burner phones, paid for everything in cash, and did our best to stay off the grid. But no matter where we went, they found us. The black SUV reappeared, always parked just far enough to be barely noticeable, but close enough to remind us they were watching. The notes kept coming too, each one more threatening than the last. "You can't run forever," one of them said. "We will find you," said another. We tried to live as normally as possible, but the constant fear was suffocating. Emma was having panic attacks, and I was barely sleeping. We were both exhausted, physically and mentally. One night, as we lay in another cheap motel room, Emma turned to me and said, "We need to end this. We need to go back." At first, I thought she was crazy. Go back to Disneyland? The place where all this started. But the more we talked about it, the more it made sense. We needed answers, and the only way to get them was to confront whatever was behind this head-on. We made a plan. We would go back to Disneyland, but this time we'd be prepared. We gathered supplies, flashlights, weapons, anything we could think of that might help us survive. We also contacted a few people from the online forum who had shared similar experiences. Some of them agreed to meet us there, to face whatever darkness lurked in the park together. I don't know what we'll find, but we can't keep living like this. We need to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. We're heading out tomorrow. I'll update you all as soon as I can. Wish us luck. Hey, Reddit, it's Ryan again. Sorry for the delay, but things have been absolutely insane. Emma and I went back to Disneyland, and what we discovered was beyond anything we could have imagined. Here's what happened. We arrived in LA late at night and checked into a small motel near the park. The place was seedy, but we were too focused on our mission to care. We had a few people from the online forum meeting us there. Dave, an ex-Disneyland employee who had experienced strange things, and Sarah, who had lost her brother under similar circumstances. We met in our room to discuss the plan. Dave told us about hidden entrances and maintenance tunnels that weren't on any map. He said there were rumors among the staff about a secret part of the park, a place where people disappeared. He had never seen it himself, but he had heard enough to know it was real. The next day, we entered the park as regular tourists, blending in with the crowd. The atmosphere felt different this time, darker, more sinister. Every smile seemed forced, every laugh tinged with something unsettling. We followed Dave's lead, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the main attractions. We found the entrance to the maintenance tunnels behind a staff-only door near Space Mountain. Dave used an old employee keycard, and we slipped inside. The tunnels were dark and claustrophobic, the air thick with the smell of mildew, and something else, something metallic and rotten. We moved quickly and quietly, our flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. After what felt like hours of navigating the labyrinthine tunnels, we came to a heavy steel door. Dave said this was it, the entrance to the secret section of the park. My heart was pounding as we pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was colder here, and the silence was deafening. The place looked like a twisted version of Disneyland, with rusted rides and decaying structures. It was like stepping into a forgotten nightmare. We moved cautiously, every creak and groan of the old metal setting our nerves on edge. We found more of those strange symbols carved into the walls, and the deeper we went, the more disturbing the scenes became. There were rooms filled with old, blood-stained costumes, photos of terrified people, and makeshift altars with disturbing offerings, broken toys, animal bones, and candles burned down to stubs. Then we heard it, the same growling noise from before. We turned off our flashlights and hid, listening as the sounds grew closer. I could barely breathe, the fear gripping me so tightly I thought I might pass out. The creatures emerged from the darkness, their grotesque forms barely visible in the dim light. They moved with an eerie grace, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. We stayed hidden until they passed, then continued deeper into the park. That's when we found the control room. It was filled with monitors and control panels, all still operational despite the decay around them. Sarah gasped when she saw one of the screens. It was showing live footage from various parts of the park. including the main attractions and the secret section we were in. "This is how they watch us," Dave whispered. "They see everything." Emma pointed to one of the monitors. It was showing a group of people in a brightly lit room, looking terrified. "Those are the missing people," she said, her voice trembling. We knew we had to get them out. Dave found a map on one of the desks, and we quickly planned our rescue. The room where the people were held was deep in the heart of this twisted version of Disneyland, heavily guarded by the creatures. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find: metal pipes, broken chairs, anything that could be used as a weapon. As we made our way to the holding area, the air grew colder and the feeling of being watched intensified. We found the room, and through a small window, we saw them, the missing people, huddled together, their eyes filled with despair. One of them was Jake, Sarah's brother. We broke the lock and burst inside, quickly explaining who we were and what we were doing. They were weak, some injured, but they were alive. We helped them up and started the long trek back to the surface. The creatures were everywhere, and we had to fight our way through. It was brutal. The things were strong and relentless, but we fought with everything we had. We lost Dave in the struggle. One of the creatures grabbed him, pulling him into the darkness. His screams echoed through the tunnels, and I knew we couldn't save him. We had to keep moving. Finally, we reached the exit, bursting into the daylight, gasping for air. The park was still bustling with tourists, oblivious to the horrors lurking beneath their feet. We called the police and EMTs, explaining everything. This time, they believed us. The evidence was undeniable. The park was shut down, and an investigation launched. The media went wild, but the real story never made it to the public. The authorities kept it quiet, not wanting to cause a panic. The official story was that it was an elaborate hoax, a prank gone wrong. But we knew the truth. Emma and I are still trying to rebuild our lives. The nightmares haven't stopped, and the feeling of being watched never truly went away. We've moved to a different city, changed our names, trying to start fresh. But every time I close my eyes, I see those creatures, hear Dave's screams, and feel the cold, dark air of that twisted version of Disneyland. We're doing our best to move on, but some things can't be forgotten. If you ever see cheap tickets at Disneyland on the dark web, don't buy them. Some deals are too good to be true, and some places should never be explored. Hey, Reddit, it's Ryan one last time. I wish I could tell you this is where our nightmare ended, but there's one final chapter to this story. It's taken me a while to gather the courage to write this down, but you deserve to know the whole truth. After the park was shut down and the investigation started, Emma and I thought we'd be safe. We moved to a new city, like I mentioned before, trying to start over, but the past has a way of catching up with you. A few months after we settled into our new place, strange things started happening again. It began with small things, our mail being tampered with, items in our apartment being moved when we weren't home. We installed more security cameras, but they didn't catch anything unusual. It was like whoever was doing this knew how to avoid them. One night, I woke up to the sound of Emma screaming. I rushed to her side and found her sitting up in bed, drenched in sweat, her eyes wide with terror. She told me she'd seen one of the creatures standing at the foot of our bed, watching us. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was just a nightmare, but deep down, I was terrified. The next day, we found another note on our doorstep. This one was different. It wasn't a threat. It simply said, "You can't escape." The handwriting was the same as before, and it sent chills down my spine. We knew then that no matter where we went, they would find us. Emma suggested we reach out to Detective Harris again, but when we called, we were told he was no longer with the force. They wouldn't tell us why, but I had a sinking feeling it had something to do with our case. We were on our own. We decided to go back to the online forum, seeking help from the community. We found a few people who were still willing to talk to us, and they shared their own experiences. It seemed that everyone who had encountered the dark side of Disneyland was being hunted. Some had gone into hiding. Others had vanished without a trace. One user, who went by the name of Watcher, claimed to have information that could help us. He said he knew where the creatures came from and how to stop them. Desperate for answers, we agreed to meet him in a public place, a busy coffee shop in broad daylight. Watcher turned out to be an older man, gaunt and weary-looking, with a haunted expression. He told us a story that sounded like something out of a horror movie, about an ancient cult that had infiltrated Disneyland, using the park as a front for their rituals. They believed that the park's joyful energy could be harnessed for dark purposes, and they used the secret section of the park for their ceremonies. The creatures were the result of their experiments, twisted souls trapped in monstrous forms. Watcher said the only way to stop them was to destroy the place where the rituals were conducted, a hidden chamber beneath the abandoned part of the park. He gave us a detailed map and a key, insisting that this was the only way to end the curse for good. Emma and I were terrified, but we knew we had to do it. We couldn't keep running. We gathered a few supplies, flashlights, matches, anything we could use to destroy the chamber. We drove back to LA, hearts heavy with dread. Entering the park again felt like stepping into the jaws of a beast. It was deserted, cordoned off by the authorities, but we found a way in through one of the old maintenance tunnels. The place was even more decayed and eerie than before. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of rusting metal. Following the map, we made our way to the hidden chamber. The door was ancient, covered in the same strange symbols we'd seen before. Using the key Watcher had given us, we unlocked it and stepped inside. The chamber was horrifying. It was filled with relics of dark rituals, altars, bones, and ancient texts. The air was thick with a malevolent energy. We knew we had to act quickly. We started setting fire to everything, the flames consuming the darkness, the oppressive energy lifting as the chamber burned. But then we heard them, the creatures. They came out of the shadows, drawn by the destruction of their sanctuary. Emma and I fought with everything we had, but they were relentless. Just as one of them was about to overpower me, a burst of light filled the chamber. I turned to see Watcher standing at the entrance, holding a flare. He threw it into the room, igniting the remaining relics and sending the creatures into a frenzy. "We have to go," he shouted, pulling us towards the exit. We ran, the fire spreading behind us, the creatures' screams echoing through the tunnels. We barely made it out before the entire section collapsed, the ground shaking with the force of the explosion. Outside, we watched as the fire consumed the abandoned part of the park. The creatures were gone, their sanctuary destroyed. For the first time in months, we felt a sense of relief. Watcher disappeared after that night. We tried to contact him, but his account on the forum was deleted, and we never saw him again. Emma and I returned to our new home, hoping that this time we'd truly be free. It's been a year since then, and things have finally started to feel normal again. We still have nightmares, and we're always looking over our shoulders, but the feeling of being watched has faded. We're slowly rebuilding our lives, trying to find some semblance of peace. So, if you ever come across cheap tickets to Disneyland on the dark web, remember our story. Some deals are too good to be true, and some places should never be explored. Stay safe and always trust your instincts. You never know what darkness might be lurking behind the happiest place on earth. Thank you for listening, and stay safe out there.